The envelope was already open when Decker found it. Not torn, opened clean, like someone had run a thumbnail under the seal with steady hands and absolutely no intention of putting it back. It sat on the gas tank of his 1974 Harley-Davidson Ironhead Sportster, balanced there between the gauges like it had been placed by someone who knew the bike well enough to know it wouldn't slide. The tank was cold. The envelope was dry. Which meant whoever had left it had come and gone before the Nebraska snow started falling, before the temperature dropped to 11 degrees, before Decker had walked out of the Platte River Saloon at midnight with frost already forming in his beard. He stood in the parking lot on Highway 30 in North Platte, Nebraska, and held the envelope under the one yellow streetlight that still worked. The handwriting on the front said 3 words. Just 3. In handwriting he hadn't seen in 9 years. It said, "Come home, brother." And then the snow came harder. What you're about to hear is the kind of story that doesn't get told in courtrooms or newspapers. It gets told later, much later, by the road itself, by the particular silence of a 2-lane highway at 4 in the morning, by the sound a Harley engine makes when a man decides he is done running. This is a story about what loyalty costs when the whole world has already made up its mind. About what a man carries when the carrying nearly kills him. About a road that runs 2,847 miles from the high plains of Nebraska to the rocky coast of Oregon, and what was waiting at the end of it. But first, the letter. Decker Malone was 51 years old, 6'2", with hands that had been scarred by engine grease and barbed wire in roughly equal measure since the age of 14. He had ridden with the Iron Meridian Motorcycle Club out of Medford, Oregon, for 17 years before the night in 2014 that took everything. He had not returned to Oregon since. For 9 years he had worked harvest circuits and ranch jobs across the interior of the country, South Dakota wheat fields, Wyoming cattle stations, Kansas grain elevators, and lately, a mechanic's bay behind a truck stop in North Platte where a quiet man named Gerald asked no questions and paid in cash on Fridays. Decker was good at disappearing. He had been doing it long enough that he had almost convinced himself it was living. He stood in that parking lot for a long time, the envelope in one hand and the snow falling heavier now, building a thin white line along the top of the Sportster's handlebars. He already knew what the letter said. He had been expecting it the way you expect a bill you know you can't pay, with a specific dread that has its own weather, its own particular cold. He unfolded the single page inside. The handwriting was his brother Caleb's. 53 years old, left-handed, the capital letters still tilted at the same angle they had tilted when Caleb was riding in the back of a school bus in Jackson County, Oregon, in 1981. Some things about a person never change. The letter was short. Caleb had never been a man who used more words than a job required. It said, Decker. Marcus Elroy died 3 weeks ago. Heart attack in his kitchen in Grants Pass. Before he died he told his daughter something. She went to the sheriff. There is a new hearing. February 14th. You have to come home. Rafe needs you there. The club needs you there. I know what you think. I know what 9 years does to a man. Come anyway. The old Meridian matters. Caleb. Decker read it twice. He folded it back into the envelope and put the envelope in the inside pocket of his leather jacket, against the left side of his chest where he could feel it when he breathed. Marcus Elroy. The name was a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went all the way back to August of 2014. Rafe Malone, Decker's younger brother, 29 years old at the time, prospect in the Iron Meridian, had been convicted of armed robbery and aggravated assault following an incident at a liquor store on Rogue River Highway outside Grants Pass, Oregon. The victim, a clerk named Harold Finch, had been beaten badly. The cash drawer cleaned out. The security footage had been conveniently corrupted, a malfunction attributed to moisture damage in the camera housing. 3 witnesses had placed a man matching Rafe's description leaving the parking lot at the approximate time. The police had found a wad of cash in the saddlebag of Rafe's 1998 Harley-Davidson Dyna Wide Glide, $1,240 in mixed bills, which matched the approximate amount taken from the register. Rafe had sworn, standing in the courtroom in the suit their mother had ironed, that he had never been inside that store. He had been at the Iron Meridian Clubhouse on Crater Lake Highway, he said. He had witnesses. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. Rafe had gone to Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, Oregon, with a 6-year sentence. And Marcus Elroy, who had, Decker had long believed, orchestrated the entire frame, had spent those 9 subsequent years continuing to run his pawnshop empire in Grants Pass and breathing the same free Oregon air as everyone else. The thing about Marcus Elroy was that he had needed the Iron Meridian out of his way. The club held a lease on a piece of land along the Applegate River that Elroy had been trying to acquire for a development deal since 2012. The club had refused to sell. 2 months after Rafe went to prison, the remaining members of the Iron Meridian had quietly and separately decided they had no more appetite for trouble with the law, and the club had dissolved. The land lease had lapsed. Elroy had acquired the parcel in the spring of 2015. Decker had known all of this. He had tried to make people see it. His effort had cost him a broken nose, a night in Josephine County Jail for disorderly conduct, and a restraining order that kept him 500 feet from Marcus Elroy's person and property. And then, with Rafe already serving time and the club already gone and Decker himself looking at potential charges for harassment, he had made the decision that had haunted him ever since. He had gotten on his Ironhead and ridden east on Interstate 84, and he had not stopped. He told himself he would come back when he had something to bring. Something that mattered. Some piece of leverage or evidence that could actually cut through 9 years of settled law. He told himself this every night for 9 years, and every morning the horizon had been the same flat, empty highway, and the evidence had never materialized, and Rafe had served his 6 years and been released in 2020 with a felony record that followed him like a second shadow. And now Marcus Elroy was dead. And apparently, before he died, he had said something to his daughter. Decker stood in the North Platte parking lot until snow had covered his boots to the ankle. Then he went back inside the truck stop, sat at the counter with a cup of coffee he did not drink, and stared at the wall until Gerald came in at 6 a.m. and found him still there. "You look like a man who got told something he already knew," Gerald said. Decker set the coffee cup down. "I need to be in Medford, Oregon by February 14th. Gerald looked at the snow against the window. Looked back at Decker. "That's about 2 weeks out." 2 weeks and 2 days. "That's a long ride in winter." "Yes, it is." Gerald was quiet for a moment, wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen better years. The Sportster going to make it? And here was the thing Decker had not allowed himself to think about until Gerald said it plainly: the 1974 Ironhead Sportster with 230,000 miles on it, rebuilt carburetor, replaced primary chain, cracked left front fork seal that wept a thin line of oil every morning like a wound that wouldn't close. The bike that had carried him out of Oregon and across every flat state between there and here, through 1,000 cold mornings and 112 nights parked under whatever shelter the road offered. He knew every sound that engine made. He knew the slight hesitation at 62 miles per hour that disappeared at 65. He knew the smell of the exhaust when she ran rich on cold mornings, slightly sweet, slightly wrong, the way anything old and strong-willed smells when it's working harder than it should. "She'll make it," he said. Gerald nodded once, the way a man nods when he respects a decision he wouldn't make for himself. He reached under the counter and set down a road atlas, one of the spiral-bound Rand McNally's, from the rack by the door. "Coffee's on me," he said. Decker spent that morning planning the route at the counter while the snow filled the parking lot outside. He traced the path with a finger that left a faint smudge on the paper: west on Interstate 80 through North Platte and Ogallala and Julesburg, Colorado, then picking up Interstate 76 into Denver, then I-70 through the Rockies to Grand Junction, then US 6 and US 50 through Utah's Canyon Country to I-15 north, then across Nevada on US 93, then I-84 into Oregon. 2,847 miles by his count, give or take the variations the weather would force on him. He called Caleb from the truck stop pay phone. There was still one, an artifact Gerald maintained out of some stubborn affection for old infrastructure. The phone rang 4 times. Then Caleb's voice, deeper than Decker remembered, roughened by years. You got it. A statement, not a question. Caleb had always known when something landed. I got it. You coming? February 14th. Tell Rafe. There was a pause. Not silence. Decker could hear wind on Caleb's end, the particular high-pitched organ wind off the Siskius that he had not heard in 9 years. He'll be glad, Caleb said finally. He won't say it like that. But he will. Decker hung up. He finished the cold coffee. He went out to the bike, brushed the snow off the seat and the tank with a gloved hand, and kicked the engine to life in the parking lot on Highway 30 in North Platte, Nebraska, at 9:47 in the morning on February 1, 2023. The Ironhead caught on the third kick, coughed once, steadied, and settled into its particular uneven idle, the mechanical heartbeat he had fallen asleep to in 100 roadside camps. He let her warm up for 10 minutes, watching the exhaust curl white in the cold air. Then he pulled west onto the empty highway, the snow still coming down, the road ahead gray and dissolving into gray. The first 200 miles were the hardest kind of hard, not dramatic, just relentlessly cold and flat and demanding, the way Nebraska is in February, an honest brutality that doesn't dress itself up. The interstate ran west through rangeland and frozen cornfields, the horizons wide and indifferent, the sky a single white sheet from edge to edge. Decker rode with his chin tucked and his body as close to the tank as a big man could get, trying to stay inside the wind shadow his own bulk created. The temperature sat at 17 degrees by the time he reached Ogallala, 82 miles out, and his left hand had gone mostly numb despite the liner gloves and the heavy leather gauntlets over them. He stopped at a Flying J outside Ogallala, walked inside with the stiff-legged gait of a man whose joints had been arguing with him for the last hour. An older woman at the counter looked at him over her reading glasses with an expression that fell somewhere between concern and professional assessment. He ordered eggs and hash browns and hot coffee and ate at a table by the window where he could see the Sportster in the lot, the snow building up again on the seat. The letter was in his chest pocket. He could feel it when he reached for his coffee cup. He thought about Rafe. 29 years old when they put him inside, the age when a man's life is still fully in motion, when every door is still open, when the future is still a thing you can believe in without having to work at it. 6 years gone from that. Released at 35 with a record and nothing else except the address of a halfway house in Salem and a state-issued check for $47 and the knowledge that the man who had done this to him was still walking around free, running his pawnshops, eating his breakfast. Rafe would be 42 now. Decker tried to picture him and kept seeing 29. He paid for his meal, went back out to the lot, brushed the snow off the seat again, and rode on. By the time he crossed into Colorado on I-76, the sky had cleared to a flat, pale blue and the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees into the single digits, but visibility was wide open and the road was dry and the Ironhead was running clean and strong, the engine note rising and steadying as he pushed her up to 70 on the empty interstate. There is a particular quality of riding in winter cold that has no equivalent, the air so dense it almost has weight, the sound of the engine sharp and close, every mechanical function of the bike audible in a way it isn't in summer heat. You hear everything. Every valve. Every chain link. Every whisper the road surface sends up through the frame. He heard, somewhere around Fort Morgan, Colorado, a subtle change in the engine's voice. A very faint knock, not in the top end, not a ticking valve, but deeper, down in the lower half, in the area of the flywheel or possibly the primary. He backed off the throttle slightly and listened. The knock faded. He held 65 for 20 miles, monitoring it. The engine ran smooth. Sometimes old bikes talk to you and are telling you nothing. Sometimes they are telling you everything. The difference is usually obvious in retrospect. He reached Denver by mid-afternoon, refueled at a station on Colfax Avenue where a young man with neck tattoos admired the Ironhead with the specific reverence that old iron commands in people who understand what they are looking at. 74 Sportster, he said. 74. What's the mileage? 230,000 and change. The young man let out a low whistle, crouching down to look at the primary cover. She oil much? Left fork seal. She slow about it. You going far? Oregon. The young man stood up and looked at Decker the way you look at someone who has just said something that is either admirable or foolish, and he was not yet sure which. Decker topped the tank, paid, and pulled back onto Colfax heading toward the interstate, the Denver skyline flat and glittering in the late afternoon light behind him. The Rockies in February are a different country. He took I-70 west out of Denver and watched the foothills rise and the temperature drop simultaneously, the two events perfectly coordinated, as if the mountains themselves were making a point. By the time he reached the Eisenhower Tunnel at 11,158 feet, the temperature gauge on his chest thermometer read 4 degrees above zero and the road surface through the tunnel was sheened with a thin film of mineral seep that glittered in the tunnel lights and required a delicacy with the throttle that he gave it without thinking, years of mountain riding converting themselves into automatic adjustments in the wrists. On the other side of the tunnel, the western slope opened up in the last of the day's light, enormous, a landscape that seems to exceed the capacity of human perception, the canyon walls descending toward the Colorado River in colors that winter strips back to their essentials, rust and gray and dark green and, far below, the river itself, black in the shadow of the canyon walls. He stopped at a turnout above Glenwood Canyon and stood beside the Ironhead for a few minutes, not thinking anything in particular, just looking. The engine ticked as it cooled. The wind off the canyon was dry and cold and smelled of pine resin and the mineral smell of cold rock. He had passed through here before, years ago, on a summer run with the full club, 8 bikes strung out across 2 lanes, Rafe on the Dyna somewhere in the middle, Caleb riding sweep on his 1979 Shovelhead, all of them loud and present and alive in the particular way you are alive when you're riding with your people. He did not let himself stay in that memory long. He got back on the bike and rode down into the canyon. He spent the first night in a motel outside Grand Junction, Colorado, a $12 room at a place called the Mesa View that hadn't updated anything since 1987, with a parking lot he could see from the bed and a heater that worked in 30-minute cycles if you kept feeding quarters into the wall unit. He lay on top of the covers with his jacket on and the envelope on the pillow beside him and stared at the water-stained ceiling tile and thought about the name Marcus Elroy had said before he died. Thought about what kind of man tells a secret on his deathbed, whether it's guilt or just the way a body starts releasing its holds one by one when the machinery finally runs out. He thought about Elroy's daughter. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what exactly had been said. He knew only what Caleb's letter had told him, which was almost nothing. Sleep came late and shallow and full of the specific dreams that come to men on long roads, not nightmares exactly, just the mind processing distance, the sense of movement without destination, the highway unreeling behind closed eyes. He was back on the road at 5:30 a.m. Utah entered without announcement, the way Utah always does, a sign on the interstate and then the immediate, vertiginous sense that the landscape has changed its terms. The color of the rock going from Colorado brown to Utah red, the formations rising out of the desert floor in shapes that seem like the work of something other than simple erosion. He rode south on I-70 through the San Rafael swell as the sun came up, the shadows of the rock formation stretching across the highway in long purple stripes. The road was empty. He had not seen another vehicle in 30 miles. The Ironhead was running well. The knock he had heard outside Fort Morgan had not returned. He let himself believe, provisionally, that it had been nothing. He thought about the February 14th deadline. 12 days when he'd left North Platte. Now 9. The mathematics of the journey were straightforward enough, if the weather held and the bike held and the mountain passes held. 3 variables that February in the Mountain West treated as suggestions rather than constants. He stopped for fuel and food in Green River, Utah, a town that exists primarily as a place for people who are going somewhere else to pause. At the diner attached to the gas station, a counter stool, a woman in her 60s with the unhurried manner of someone who has served 3 generations of transients poured his coffee without being asked. He was the only customer. A small television on a shelf above the coffee machines played weather news with the sound turned down. He watched the weather map. A system was building off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, not yet a storm but the architecture of one, the isobars compressing over the Oregon coast in a way that meant something was coming by the end of the week. He did the arithmetic. If he could make Nevada by tomorrow, he could be at the Oregon border by the 5th or 6th. That put him inside whatever was building, but he'd be in the lower elevations of the Willamette Valley by then, and whatever came off the coast would hit the Coast Range first, lose most of its force before it reached the interior. It was the passes between Nevada and Oregon that concerned him, specifically the stretch on I-84 through the Blue Mountains, which in February could close with almost no warning. He ate his eggs. He drank his coffee. He left a $5 bill under the cup and walked back out to the Ironhead in the thin Utah morning light. The engine caught on the first kick. Nevada took him in at the Utah border with a vast and specific indifference. The Great Basin Desert in winter has a quality of having been drained of something essential. The dry lake beds white with mineral salt, the mountain ranges parallel and remote and identically brown, the sky above them a blue so deep it looks almost artificial. US 93 north from near Ely gave him the cleanest riding of the trip, the road straight as a survey line across the valley floors, the temperature risen to a comparative warmth of 32 degrees, the Ironhead finding her stride at a comfortable 68 and holding it. For long stretches of those Nevada miles he allowed himself the thing a long road can give you if you let it, a particular suspension of thought, the mind gone quiet, the body reduced to its necessary functions, the sense of being exactly where you are and nowhere else. Rafe had called him once, about 3 months after his release. A Wednesday afternoon in 2020, Decker at the bench in Gerald's garage replacing a head gasket on a Peterbilt, the cell phone propped against a toolbox. The conversation had been brief and had covered almost nothing. "How are you?" "Good." "Where are you?" "Nebraska still." "What are you doing?" "Working." And then a silence that stretched long enough that Decker had checked the screen to see if the call was still connected. "Deck." Just his name. "I know it wasn't your fault." Another silence. "I know you tried." And then Rafe had said goodbye and hung up, and Decker had gone back to the head gasket, and his hands had been steady and the tears had fallen straight down onto the engine block and evaporated in the heat. He had not called Rafe back. He had told himself he was waiting for a reason to call back that would mean something. A thing to bring. Something that mattered. He told himself that now, riding across Nevada, was the first time he had truly had something to bring. He crossed into Idaho on I-84 west of Twin Falls and felt the temperature drop and the sky change, the open desert cold of Nevada giving way to the deeper, moister cold of the Snake River Plain, clouds building along the northern horizon, the wind picking up from the southwest with the weight of water in it. The Ironhead ran steady. He had stopped outside Jackpot, Nevada, to check the fork seal. The oil weep had increased slightly over the last 300 miles, not dramatically, not yet dangerous, but enough to require attention. He cleaned the fork tube with a rag, checked the lower leg, tightened the dust seal as much as it would take. It would hold. Probably. That word, probably, carried a specific meaning on a 2,800-mile winter run. It meant, hold through today. Then we reassess. He was in Twin Falls, Idaho, on the evening of February 5th, eating a hamburger in a booth at a diner on Addison Avenue, when the storm found him. It had not been on the radar when he checked in Nevada. Or it had been there but smaller, something the meteorologists had assessed as a minor system that would spend itself over the high desert before reaching populated areas. Those assessments sometimes fail. This one failed dramatically. The Pacific system that had been building off the Oregon coast had deepened faster than the models predicted, pulling a second Arctic air mass down from British Columbia at the same time, the two systems meeting over southern Idaho in the early evening of the 5th with a sudden and complete commitment to winter. The temperature at 7 p.m. in Twin Falls was 31 degrees. At 9 p.m. it was 14. At midnight it was 4 below. And the snow. It came first as a dry, granular scatter against the diner windows, the kind of snow that looks decorative and harmless. By 9 o'clock it was a full blizzard, wind-driven and horizontal, the parking lot outside the window disappearing into white, the street lights across Addison Avenue reduced to soft halos with nothing definite at their centers. He sat in the diner booth until 10 o'clock when the owner, a compact woman named Diane who had the manner of someone who had managed other people's emergencies professionally for 30 years, told him the roads were already closing and did he have a place to stay. He did not. She pointed him to a motel 3 blocks east and told him to be careful and that the Ironhead should be brought inside if possible. He thanked her, paid, and made 3 trips back and forth through the blizzard to wrestle the bike through the motel room's double doors and get it into the room itself, the room suddenly becoming very small with a 1974 Harley-Davidson Sportster occupying a third of the floor space, smelling of cold metal and gasoline, which was, in Decker's experience, not an unpleasant smell in an enclosed space. He sat on the edge of the bed with the bike beside him and worked through the arithmetic again. The roads in Idaho were closed. The Blue Mountains in Oregon were certainly impassable. He had 7 days until the February 14th hearing. He needed 2, maybe 2.5 days of writing once the roads opened. The storm, by what he could gather from the motel's television, was expected to break by February 7th. That left him 5 days. That was enough. Barely enough, precisely enough, the kind of enough that requires everything to go right from the moment of departure. He pulled the letter from his chest pocket. Read it again. Caleb's left-hand slant, the capital R in Rafe's name, the particular way his brother had written "I know what 9 years does to a man," not as an accusation, not quite as forgiveness either. As a fact. Caleb had always dealt in facts the way other men deal in currency, carefully and without waste. He lay back on the bed with his boots on and the letter on his chest and the Ironhead 3 feet away, and he thought about what 9 years does to a man. He thought about it with the specific, unflinching attention of someone who has avoided thinking about it for 9 years and has finally been cornered by an empty motel room in Twin Falls, Idaho, in a blizzard. What 9 years does to a man who leaves, it makes him good at explaining to himself why the leaving was necessary, and then good at believing the explanation, and then, finally, good at almost never having to think about it at all, because the explanation has become so smooth and practiced that it no longer requires examination. And underneath that smoothness, untouched and intact, the original thing. The thing he had not been able to fix. The face in the courtroom when the verdict was read, Rafe, 29 years old, turning to look for Decker in the gallery, finding him there, holding eye contact for one long moment before the deputies moved him toward the door. That look. Decker had been carrying it for 9 years in the same place he was carrying the letter now. The storm broke on the morning of February 7th, as predicted, leaving the Snake River plain under 14 inches of new snow and a sky of absolute, washed-out clarity. The roads opened in stages. I-84 West was passable by noon, the Oregon state line by mid-afternoon, but the Blue Mountains section, the stretch between Baker City and Pendleton on the old Oregon Trail corridor, remained closed until early on the 8th. He rode out of Twin Falls on the morning of the 8th into cold so pure it seemed to have a visible quality, the light off the snow giving everything that characteristic flat brightness that makes distances deceptive. The Ironhead ran rough for the first 20 minutes, the carburetor needed persuading in the sub-zero residual cold, the engine reluctant, then grumbling, then, slowly, finding its normal voice. He sat in the parking lot and let her warm fully before he trusted her to the road. 6 days to the hearing. Roughly 1,200 miles. He was across the Idaho-Oregon border by 1 in the afternoon, the Snake River Gorge below him dramatic and ice-edged, the basalt walls of Farewell Bend dark against the snow. Oregon. The word had a weight he hadn't anticipated. He had spent 9 years making Oregon a direction, west, always west, eventually, rather than a place. Now the road sign said it plainly, Oregon. Welcome. And underneath that, a mileage number to Portland, which was north of where he needed to go, but still, Oregon. The same rocks. The same particular shade of gray-green in the juniper along the canyon walls. The same sky that sat just slightly lower over Oregon than it did over Nevada or Utah, or maybe that was memory adjusting to proportions. He pushed hard through the eastern Oregon high desert, through Burns, and through the long empty stretch of US 20 before picking up I-84 again south of the Blue Mountains. The mountains themselves were buried and still and enormous, the road through them cleared to 2 lanes with packed snow walls 8 feet high on either side, the surface sanded but cold. He rode through them carefully, the Ironhead walking a narrow line between the ruts left by trucks, the fork seal weeping steadily now, the oil dripping off the lower leg of the fork and hitting the front wheel and being thrown in a thin spray that he could see from the saddle. He monitored it. The handling was not yet compromised. The drip was steady, not accelerating. It would hold. He was in Pendleton by 4 in the afternoon, the Blue Mountains behind him. 5 days to the hearing. 430 miles. He stopped in Pendleton for the night and sat in his room and called Caleb. "Where are you?" Caleb asked. "Pendleton." "The mountains didn't give you trouble?" Fork seals weeping. "Mountains were okay." A pause. "Rafe knows you're coming." "What did he say?" "He said okay." Another pause. "The way he said okay, Deck, the way he said it." Decker sat with that. "Tell me about Elroy's daughter." Caleb took a breath. "Her name is Susan Elroy Carmichael. 40 years old, lives in Ashland." Apparently Elroy told her, in the last week before he died, that the cash found in Rafe's saddlebag had been put there by a man Elroy had paid. A man named Dennis Coyle. Coyle worked security for one of Elroy's pawnshops. He's been dead since 2019, car accident, drunk driver, nothing connected. But Susan remembered the name, remembered because Elroy seemed frightened when he said it. Said he needed her to know in case someone came asking. Caleb paused. "She went to the sheriff 3 weeks ago. Took a statement. The DA's office reviewed it. There's enough for a new evidentiary hearing. The judge is going to hear a motion to vacate the conviction." Decker's hand tightened on the phone. "What does the DA's office say?" "They're not opposing it." He sat with that for a long moment. The DA not opposing. That was more than he had allowed himself to expect. That was the door opening rather than simply being knocked on. "Rafe needs to be there," Caleb said. And the judge asked if any other original witnesses would testify to Rafe's alibi. "The ones who said he was at the clubhouse that night. Most of them are gone, moved on, hard to find. But there are 2 still in the area. And Deck, there's something else." The way Caleb said those 4 words, "there's something else," carried the tone of someone who has been deciding for a long time whether to say a thing and has finally decided. "Say it," Decker said. 9 years ago, when all of this went down, Elroy had a business partner. A man named Victor Reese. Victor Reese is now a Josephine County Commissioner. He was the one who bought the Applegate land from Elroy in 2016. The DA's investigator has been asking questions about whether Reese had prior knowledge of the frame. Whether the land acquisition was the actual motive. Decker was quiet. "The story's bigger than just Rafe," Caleb said. "It was always bigger than just Rafe." "You knew that." "I knew that." "Come home, brother." He arrived in Medford, Oregon, on the morning of February 12, 2 days before the hearing, 1,400 miles from North Platte, 22 days since he had first read the letter in that parking lot on Highway 30. He came in on I-5 from the north, the Siskiyou Mountains behind him, the Rogue River Valley opening up ahead in the early light, the fields still frosted, the pear orchards bare and black, Mount McLaughlin white in the east. He knew this road the way he knew his own heartbeat, every bend of it, every change in elevation, the particular light the valley held in February mornings. He pulled into the parking lot of the Iron Meridian's old clubhouse on Crater Lake Highway. The building was a storage facility now. Someone had put a corrugated metal front on it and posted a sign about unit rentals. The parking lot was cracked and empty except for a single truck and a 1979 Harley-Davidson shovelhead with its side stand down. Caleb was leaning against the wall. He was older. Decker had prepared himself for that, and it still landed physically, the way seeing a familiar landscape altered by years always lands, the same in all the essential ways, altered in the ones you don't expect. Caleb had gone gray, fully, the dark hair they'd shared gone completely silver. The lines around his eyes were deep. He was wearing the same kind of worn Carhartt jacket he had always worn, the same lace-up work boots. He held a cup of coffee in one hand. When Decker pulled in and killed the engine, Caleb looked at the Ironhead for a long time before he looked at Decker. "Fork seal," he said, looking at the oil trail on the front wheel. It held. Caleb nodded. He held out the coffee cup, and Decker took it, and they stood in the parking lot of what used to be the Iron Meridian Clubhouse on Crater Lake Highway in Medford, Oregon, in the cold February morning, passing a cup of coffee back and forth without speaking for a long time. Sometimes silence between two people who know each other completely is the most information-dense communication available. Finally Caleb said, "Rafe's at the house. He wants to see you." "I know. He's nervous about tomorrow." "I know. He's not going to say thank you. You know that." "I don't need him to." Caleb looked at him directly for the first time. "Measuring something." 9 years, Deck. "I know what 9 years is." "I know you do." Caleb took the coffee cup back. "We all paid it, one way or another. You just paid yours differently." They rode together to Caleb's house on Stewart Avenue, the Ironhead and the Shovelhead side by side on the empty morning highway the way they had been 100 times before, the sound of two old Harleys on a familiar road carrying in it something that Decker had not felt in a very long time. The weight of belonging. The specific gravity of home. Rafe was in the kitchen. 42 years old, thicker through the shoulders than Decker remembered, with the particular stillness that men develop when they have learned at great cost to control the space they occupy. He was standing at the counter with his back to the door when they came in, and he didn't turn immediately. He finished what he was doing first, which was pouring a cup of coffee, setting the pot back, picking up the cup, and then turning around. They looked at each other across Caleb's kitchen. Rafe's face. Decker had been seeing it in memory at 29 for 9 years, and here it was at 42, and the 29-year-old was still inside it somewhere, visible in the eyes, in the line of the jaw, in the way his hands held the coffee cup. Scarred by time and by what time had held. But there. "You made it," Rafe said. "I made it. Long ride. Long ride." Rafe looked at him for another moment with those eyes that had looked for him in a courtroom 9 years ago, and then he set his cup down and crossed the kitchen floor and put both arms around his oldest brother and held on, and Decker held back, and neither of them said anything for a while. Caleb, who had seen everything and always known when to leave a room, left the room. The hearing was on February 14, 2023, in Courtroom 3 of the Jackson County Courthouse in Medford. Judge Patricia Aldridge presiding. The DA's office represented by a young assistant DA named Torres who had reviewed the file with evident discomfort and had filed a brief supporting the motion to vacate. Susan Elroy Carmichael was there, in a gray coat, with the pale, resolved look of a woman who has done something difficult and necessary and has already made peace with the consequences. She had brought documents, papers from her father's estate that corroborated aspects of his deathbed statement, records of payments made to Dennis Coyle in August of 2014. The original defense attorney, old now, white-haired, with the beaten dignity of a man who had known at the time that his client was innocent and had been unable to prove it, sat beside Rafe at